Hello. Happy Monday. It is good to see everyone. I'm Callie Knight. Today I'm going to be talking with Danielle, and we're going to be talking about co-regulation and its relationship to self-regulation. Hello to everyone who's joining. I hope everyone had a good Monday. I don't know if people are back at work yet or if kids are back yet, but I'm going to try to get Danielle in here. As y'all are coming in, you can say who you are. Tell me if you went to work today. Did anyone go to work today while I'm... Yes.
That worked perfectly. I
Perfect.
was just like, I hope this works. Now I'm going to set up my phone.
That's what I do too. I sit there and I hold it and I'm like, let's make this work. And
so
then
I have like the flat on the desk while I untake my phone out of my case.
Perfect. I asked people, I don't know if you heard as they were coming in, I asked people to tell me if they went to work today. And I'm trying to look. Let's see. We have SLPs back at work with students in Oklahoma. A lot of people here in Texas went back with students today. My husband teaches and his students come back on Thursday, which I think is kind of weird. To have your first day of school as a Thursday. But
a lot of schools, like I think we have a couple teachers that are going for in-service end of this week, and then they start next Wednesday or Thursday. I was like, whoa.
I feel like starting on a Wednesday, I could see, like, you have 3 solid days, but I thought it was kind of interesting that you would start on a Thursday, but maybe that's good. You have 2 days of laying foundations, getting, things in order, and then you can start on Monday.
Yeah, maybe it's, I guess, too, like a little bit of a foot in the door technique where you're like, just 2 days and then I have the weekend.
Exactly. Some people have their schedule completed. Oh, I see I see they start 9/1. That would be nice to start in September, but you probably get out later.
First teacher workday tomorrow. Yeah. Darn.
I was going to say, it's been crazy to see who is back and doing in-service days, who's back with kids, and who's like, I don't start for another week, or I don't start until September.
I always feel like there's such a flood of emotion because if you start later, you go later. If you start earlier, you end earlier. So it's like, I don't know. There's always a flip coin. There's always a flip coin to the sides.
Exactly. Let's see. Ends June 26th. Yeah, this past year I got out May 24th. So I guess if you start a month earlier, you do probably get out a month earlier.
How does it feel to know you're not going back? Is it hitting in a different level now than it did?
I have to say it's weird, especially seeing people post all their back to school stuff and seeing people in the district I worked in post their back to school stuff. It's very bittersweet.
Yeah. But better things are on their way, right? They're here and they're on their way. So
exactly. And I'll get back there at some point. But for now, we'll just enjoy this era of life and it'll be okay.
I love it. I love it.
But I'm excited. I have been looking forward to this literally since before I even reached out to you about doing it. Because I remember it's almost been a year since we chatted last time about this topic or a similar topic. And I was like, I could share the old live or we could just do it again.
We can do it again. And I feel like, I watched Mike's live too. I watched the recording of it, you and Mike. It was so great. And I feel like, we have a continuous pool of knowledge about these topics, like executive functions and self-regulation, co-regulation. But there's always things that are evolving and emerging. And I think it's always fun to redo them periodically to just share what's new and what we know.
Exactly. And even sometimes even if the knowledge base isn't what has developed, I feel like sometimes we've had new experiences that we can share or something that happened. And I think when people listen to these things, it's nice to get all this information, but sometimes when we can throw in those contextual examples, people are like, okay, this is real. I can do this.
Yes. Yes, you can do this. Yeah, totally.
Because I think sometimes this topic, either people haven't ever heard terms. I mean, I think executive functioning, people hear more about it and it's a term that people probably understand a loose definition. Or, I mean, you either know quite a bit or you know enough to learn more about it. Or it's like, I've heard that word, but it's probably important. I don't know. And then there are some people who are like, never heard of it. So
Yes.
I don't know where people are today. I don't know where they are on that continuum, but
We'll meet them wherever they are, right? We'll meet them wherever they are and talking about co-regulation.
exactly.
And I guess that's probably a good segue. Do you want to start chatting about it?
Let's go for it.
Let's do it. Well, I always feel like for me, an anchor is always helpful so I always talk about self-regulation first. Like, what is self-regulation?
Yes.
And, I think Mike talked about it last week. It's always great to see these exchanges of how we talk about these terms. But really, I think about self-regulation is the ability to modulate or change your energy or emotional state to achieve a goal,
Yep.
considering the social and physical demands around you. And I use energy and emotion in kind of exchange for each other because I work with a lot of autistic students, and they identify more with energy language. So I always use those two terms interchangeably. Autism Level Up, if you're not familiar with Autism Level Up, they're a phenomenal resource and they have an awesome energy meter. Love all of the work that they do. So with that anchor of self-regulation, then we can kind of jump to, okay, what is co-regulation?
Right.
And we're talking about it developmentally, Callie, but I think we've always talked about like co-regulation is also lifelong. So you're right. So co-regulation in developmental terms, and add on after I chat, because you love this topic too. Co-regulation is really the supportive interaction between an adult and a child to foster and support the development of self-regulation skills.
Yep.
And as adults, we also do it to support each other to foster or achieve a more regulated state when we're in distress or when we're dysregulated.
Exactly. And I laugh because you brought it up again. It's like co-regulation is lifelong. I think sometimes in a developmental perspective, we think of it like co-regulation like precedes self-regulation, where it's the foundation for, or we model, in these co-regulatory situations so that kids can learn to self-regulate. And I think to an extent developmentally, when you're younger, you need more co-regulation, and that steadily decreases, but that doesn't mean it ever goes away. All the time. I think you and I talked about this a while ago, where it's like sometimes when I'm in distress and I really need help, I call my mom, and that's co-regulatory, where your mom is talking through it with you and you're sharing that burden.
Yes.
And so that's part of our definition, right? Co-regulation. I mean, it's sharing the burden essentially.
It's dyadic. It's dyadic. It's back and forth. And you're right. If we have a healthy co-regulatory relationship with our earliest caregivers, then the trajectory usually is we develop lifelong healthy co-regulatory patterns. We realize that the network we create around us can be there for us. And unfortunately, kids who have had the opposite effect, who have had less responsive co-regulation in their earliest years, they're often the kids who grew up later and struggle to really relate and co-regulate with others because they didn't have those earliest wirings of support.
Exactly. I'm like also trying to man the comments, and I think you're better at watching comments. So no one's said anything, but in case anyone wants to say anything, we just had a lot of people join, so hi.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure I didn't lose any. If there were any comments, I didn't want to miss them, but hello to everyone who's hopping in.
We love comments, so people, please drop comments or questions. We
right.
love questions too.
Because, you and I could sit here and talk about this just for funsies, but we certainly want to make this helpful for other people too. So if you have questions or you have comments, yes, hi from Jamaica.
Hello. So
that fun. Lovely. So, okay, I got distracted. Here we go. Me self-regulating, getting back on track.
You were never really off track. We have a common track together. We kind of follow each other. I think so we were just talking about the definition for co-regulation overall, through that supportive interaction between an adult and a child to foster and develop self-regulation skills. Co-regulation is the foundation for how we develop self-regulation skills. Co-regulation is lifelong. And I like to think about three key pillars. Mike used pillars last week, and I think I love using common language. So three pillars of co-regulation are really providing attuned, responsive relationships, structuring the environment, and teaching, coaching, and modeling self-regulation skills. Those are the three pillars of co-regulation.
Right.
And I think about it like two glasses, and the infant's glass is pretty much empty for self-regulation skills. Right. And the adult's just kind of gradually pouring, like gradual release of responsibility throughout the child's life, kind of gradually pouring that responsibility over to the child.
Right. And I like that because I think sometimes, I think more often than not, and you tell me if I'm wrong, I think people hear more self-regulation, like that term, or they talk about that more than co-regulation. And
Oh
I
yeah.
think especially developmentally, especially for our younger kids, but this also applies, all along the developmental spectrum for age.
Yes.
Um, like co-regulation does proceed, and so when we're looking at responsibility of that regulatory support, it really is zero. Like I don't want to say they're not responsible, but it's like they don't have the ability to self-regulate, and so the responsibility is largely on the adult. And I think understanding that as a basis is going to
Yes.
help us as clinicians or parents or whoever you are go in with the right expectation, because I think sometimes we get frustrated with these kids, or it's hard because we're like, you should be doing X, or you're giving them more responsibility or co-regulatory burden, or not co-regulatory but regulatory burden than they can take by themselves. And so I like that you used that.
Yeah. And I think when we think about just using that analogy of that infant who really cannot regulate their system at all, you have a
Yep.
baby, they need you to structure their environment. They need you to provide routines and rhythms. They need you to feed their bodies. And then gradually, and this is hard for parents because if you don't know development, it's hard. It's kind of like
Yeah.
one day they can't take care of themselves at all. And then a couple of years down the road, it's like they can dress themselves, but then they still have pretty explosive reactions. And so it's kind of like, well, wait, you can do this, but you can't do that. So we've
Right.
kind of, unfortunately, for too long had this behavioral approach to regulation. Like, if you're
Mm-hmm.
not doing it, it must be something we got to correct. We got to just nix it, through behavioral approaches. But really, our society is catching up to responsive, attuned, relationships to kids to develop self-regulation skills.
Yeah. Could you let's talk examples. I think some people are probably like, that sounds like a really interesting definition. What does that look like? What could that look like?
Yeah. So, well, which part? I'm happy to provide as many examples as you want.
And I guess really any of it. I think we've kind of defined it, but it's like, what could that look like? It's like, okay, we just basically talked about how we as adults probably are going to have more responsibility to help kids. So you gave the example with like babies. So it's like, okay, maybe I work in a preschool or in a kindergarten classroom. What could I do to support? Maybe it is, I don't know. What example did you just do? Like a behavior. What we would say is, oh, I see a behavior going on, which is really just they can't regulate whatever
they can't regulate. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if we look at the three pillars, providing tuned, responsive relationships, structuring the environment, and then teaching, coaching, and modeling self-regulation skills. Let's start off with the attuned, responsive relationships.
Yes.
Attunement really means I'm going to tune into the kid in front of me and get to know them, get to know the regulation, so that I can really learn what does regulation look like for them, so that I can start to identify when they're becoming dysregulated, so I can support them to become aware of that warm, responsive relationship. I'm tuning into you, and I'm responding to how you are. So when your baby cries, you're like, oh, something happening with you. Yeah. I need to help. When your toddler becomes upset, oh, you're becoming upset. Where people become confused here, and I want to really draw a very hard line for people, is responding and attuning is not spoiling. It's developing healthy relationships and a healthy sense of self in the child. You can still hold limits and also be a warm, responding communication partner to the child.
Yes, I love like the boundaries. You can validate that what they're going through is real. And I think they need that because so many times it's like kids are crying. It's the outward manifestation of I can't regulate myself. And people are like, stop crying, or you shouldn't be crying. It's not hard. When the truth is, if we put on the lens of the child, it is. And their behavior makes sense when we understand where they're coming from.
Yes.
So yes.
I use for this part of the warm, responsive relationships. And I like to think about this being especially helpful when kids are dysregulated. This is especially helpful when kids are dysregulated. It's always helpful to attune to our kids, but it's really helpful when they're dysregulated, which means they're not in that zone of being able to have focus and goal-directed behavior. But I say the coast model. So when a child is dysregulated, or really anybody is dysregulated, check on yourself. Because you as the co-regulation partner, the most important part is that you are regulated. If you're not regulated, you're going to co-escalate versus co-regulate.
Yes, that was my favorite term from last time was you should co-regulate, not co-escalate.
Yeah, and it's really asking the question non-judgmentally, am I co-regulating here or am I co-escalating?
Yep.
And I think a lot of parents, and this was me with my kids. I had to learn what's happening for me. You know, we talked about my journey last time with my son, who just has much different developmental self-regulation skills than my daughter. So I had to learn a lot about my own self-regulation and responding to him as a co-regulation partner. So
Right.
check in on yourself, because you attending to yourself, just noticing what's happening for you when a child's becoming dysregulated, incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
Incredibly powerful. The O and the A of the coaster: observe and acknowledge. You can observe and acknowledge their experience while still
Yep.
holding the limits. That's really hard. You wanted to keep playing and it's time to move on. That's super hard. And you can just acknowledge it.
Yep.
Just acknowledge,
But
because
I'm here
it's,
to help you.
yes, it's the experience. The next step is to support them to return to regulation in whatever way that means for them. And then T, you want to store that in your mind for teach transition point, for the teaching, coaching, and modeling self-regulation skills. Store that in your mind for an area or a skill to work on for the teaching, coaching, and modeling for that child.
Perfect. I love that. I love like acronyms because they help you remember. And just so
Yes.
everyone knows, I am taking some notes so that if people are sitting here like trying to take copious notes, please just sit here and enjoy the live. You can watch it again later or I'll give a recap. So
Perfect.
so everyone knows. But that was the COAST model. That's awesome.
Yeah. So that's really providing the attuned, responsive relationships. So structuring the environment is really about engaging in rhythms and routines with kids. So parents at home, it's having routines and rhythms. But in schools, it's also kids developing self-regulation skills. Routines and rhythms are helpful anchors for them. They're helpful anchors for them to start to becoming independent people. And so that's why, consistency is really helpful for these kids developing self-regulation skills. Just ongoing activities that are pretty regular for kids in their schedules. And this is also where we really consider the developmental level of the child. It's really important. Structuring the environment means some kids might need more structure than others in their day. And that's how we support all kids. Teachers do this all the time. But for the development of self-regulation skills, this is really important.
Exactly. Let's see. So we did pillar 1. We did pillar 2. Right? Am I right?
You got it. You're
Perfect.
right. You got it. And then pillar 3 is the teaching, coaching, and the modeling. And here's where all the time we can always be modeling self-regulation skills. We can always be modeling how we are regulating when we become dysregulated. We can model our self-talk strategies. We can model planning strategies. We can model how we make plans. And we can teach these skills as well. I always like to say there often is a huge discrepancy for me. I feel like people are very eager to just teach to the upstairs brain, and I use the upstairs downstairs brain that Dr. Dan Siegel uses in the Whole Brain Child. But when we teach, like I think about some of the standard curriculums, like the 5-point scale and programs like that, those are appealing to the upstairs when a child's regulated. We have to help kids learn to climb the stairs through responsive relationships and through structuring the environment and teaching the skills to help them be able to use programs that are often taught in schools.
Exactly. And in addition to that, if anyone here hasn't seen the live that we did with Mike, that one was more like self-regulation and those strategies. And I think those strategies we talked about like explicitly teaching, but they would also fall under this little category of you modeling all those strategies. And I won't sit there and like go through all the ones we discussed, but if you haven't watched that live, then you can go back for some ideas on this little piece.
I love that. That'll be super helpful just to think about, because remember, self-regulation is like the goal-directed behavior. So when we're teaching and coaching those skills, this is where that will come in handy tremendously. But a lot of the kids that you might be listening to about this really need us to focus on each of these 3 pillars before the kids are really able to receive and be available to receive the teaching.
And I think a lot of these things, I think as not necessarily just as SLPs, but some professionals, I think, do some of these things without knowing. And I think, first of all, knowledge is power. Knowing what you're doing intentionally, like maybe you already talk through things with kids. Maybe but that's just what you do and it's worked.
Yeah.
Hopefully now you're understanding why that's working, because I think, intentionally doing that is powerful. And sometimes, you don't know what you don't know. So there are other professionals, SLPs included, other people, they have a harder time with this. And that's okay. We have to have patience with everyone, but I think it's not easy. This isn't something easy for us to, like, it requires a lot on our part.
Yeah.
If that makes
And
sense.
I think, like, to be honest, I started talking about co-regulation after my son was born, so in 2018.
Yeah.
And just then, it was just barely in, not, I don't want to say just barely, but it was in the developmental field, but it really had not crossed over to education at all that I could find. And so I want to say, like, if you were just hearing about this term or just getting language, it really has been a recent switch over to really the educational realm, embracing the terminology and wanting to talk about it.
Exactly. And I love this question that someone just asked, because I mean, we can kind of sway right into this. They say, how can preschool teachers support this? And I honestly, I want to hear what maybe both of us have to say, because I think what preschool teachers can do is probably what just about all teachers can do. But I'll let you go first, because you're my guest, and then I'll give my 2 cents.
I would love that. I would love this. I love this question. So one of the most important things I have to say as a preschool teacher, and I always tell preschool teachers this, I'm a big advocate for neurodiversity affirming practices. Yep. So really teaching your classes that all brains are amazing and all brains work differently. And all brains regulate differently. Some brains need this, some brains need that. But I think just that language in preschool for teaching and understanding self-regulation skills can help kids start to build co-regulation amongst themselves. And really, that's ideally what we're working towards. We're looking to build healthy networks of peers that can also become healthy co-regulatory partners for each other.
Yes. And they learn from your example too.
Yes,
the peers do, so.
Yep. They learn from your example. And so if we are building language that some brains transitions can just be tricky. And so kids start to understand that when Sue is really upset during a transition, it's not because Sue is, and I'm going to use terms that kids think bad or weird or strange. Her brain just needs some extra time to adjust to that transition. This is how we actually start to build in neuro-inclusivity and start to make classrooms a place where all kids can feel they belong.
Yes, I love that. I'm like taking some notes on this because that wasn't originally what came to my mind, but I'm like, oh my goodness, yes.
Yeah, it's powerful because kids often get ostracized because of their regulation differences. That's like one of the most prominent things that happens. So really, really supporting all brains are amazing. All brains do things differently. We play differently. We communicate differently. We regulate differently. Preschool teachers, I also love, I'll add a couple more ideas, Callie, and I know you've got ideas to add on.
So no, go for it.
But really warm, responsive relationships. There was a big push to really put in like calming corners and peace places in classrooms. Right. And I think theoretically that's helpful for the kids who can regulate independently. Right. And not a lot of preschoolers can. Some can, and I think that's a great place for them. But really, preschoolers, the calming corner, I want to make sure it doesn't become a go to the calming corner. It's a way where a warm, responsive relationship can happen between the teacher and the child. Instead
of just saying, I'm getting you out of, it's more like getting you out of my way than, I'm okay if you have a calming corner, but if they need you, you need to go to the calming corner too.
Yeah. And here's where we're both going to put an asterisk because we both acknowledge how hard it has been to be in the schools the last several years. So none of this I want to feel like I'm saying you should be doing this, but more like this is what really is going to work. This is what's actually going to work for the kids in school to help them develop self-regulation skills.
I like that you put the asterisk because that's exactly what I was going to say is some of these things are like, especially if you're a general education teacher in that preschool class and there's a kid, I mean, you've got who knows how many other kids, 15 probably other kids that it's hard for me to say you need to go to that calming corner. Hopefully you have an aide or hopefully there's someone else that can, if you can't handle it just where you are. Because sometimes you can handle it where you are.
Sometimes you can't handle it. And a lot of like Ross Green's collaborative and proactive solutions approach really focuses on the relationship between the teacher and the child. Yep. Because what happens often is kids struggling with self-regulation skills have an external person called in, and it kind of severs the relationship. And I know it's protocol, I know it's what some schools have to do, but if we can shift that so that the teacher can be the one to support the child, we can keep that relationship. And kids want to be in the classroom most of the time.
Yes.
Unless they have, sensory opportunities that help them stay part of the class. But kids want to be part of the community.
Exactly. And that was one of the examples I was going to give is I have a certain student who was in a kindergarten class, and I frequently got called in for this student. And, at first it was good because I could see what was going on. I could watch, where this teacher was struggling. But then I did tell the teacher, I was like, I don't feel like I'm just going to stop, answering the phone and coming over. But I want some of these moments to be coaching moments because I need you to be able to do this. Yes, I am busy, but it's the exact reason you said. I think sometimes they're like, well, it's your job. You're the case manager. And I'm like, I am, but this is a group effort. And I think the reason you gave is probably the primary reason.
The relationship. It's all about the relationship. And, kids really struggling with self-regulation, we have to go back to that first pinnacle, the responsive, attuned relationship. And I see Vanny, I don't know the username, so I want to make sure don't say the whole thing, but if you have a child that reacts to uncomfortable situations by running. So I think I want to be really cautious about any specific questions about students because we don't know the history, we don't know the child, but I'm going to provide some generalized information about this type of scenario.
Right.
So you have a flight behavior, which is a limbic system based behavior. So the team needs to get together and get curious about what is driving the dysregulation. You always start by identifying regulation first, when, how, why is the child regulated, and then start to get curious about the limbic system behavior, one of your 4 Fs. You've got a flight behavior. I would then strongly encourage the team to use Ross Green's CPS approach, collaborative and proactive solutions, to really proactively problem solve around this scenario to help the child. But again, remember, to all students, the fact that when the child has a limbic system based behavior, everyone, the calm, cool, collected, just identifying that somebody is learning to develop self-regulation or learning to develop regulation, and we're here to support them. And then continue moving on as much as possible, that the class will follow your lead.
Exactly. And I like that you use the word proactive. This is probably not what you're asking, but essentially for those things you want to, if you get curious, sometimes you can, I don't want to say nip these things in the butt, but you can get kind of a handle on them. Doesn't mean they're not going to still happen. Sometimes things are going to happen, you don't know why, and that could be this case that you're asking. And in that case, all I can say is do your best to keep them safe in the moment, but then do exactly what you said. Get curious to see why did that happen and how can I support them to prevent it next time. Yeah. But proactivity is probably the best way to tackle.
Especially if it's, and this sounds like an identified concern, like running. So uncomfortable situations by running. All right. So they clearly haven't had a chance to maybe practice alternatives to managing or handling that dysregulation. Yep. So your limbic system is really strong. It's going to have you do those 4 Fs if you're incredibly dysregulated. So if you can't fight, you flight. So really teaching other strategies around it. Video modeling, social stories, etc., with the whole team involved.
And something else that I've done, I don't know that I've ever done this with preschoolers. I've done this with kindergartners and sometimes in push-in lessons when you were talking about like inclusivity. Sometimes I'm like, and guess what? This is how everyone's brain works. And I talk about, when we get to fight or flight, we're like, guess what? We need blood in certain places. When we have blood in our brain, we can be cool, we can feel good, not using any technical terms, but essentially saying we're good when we got the blood in our heads. But guess what? Sometimes the blood leaves our heads. And guess where it usually goes? To our hands and our feet. So we're either going to fight and, you can get them up and move. We fight or we run away. Is that what we want to do? And everyone knows the answers. But I think sometimes understanding even what is going on, even when they're young, that's powerful for them, interoceptively to understand what's going on. We all go through that.
Yes. And I think, I have gotten some pushback from, it's gotten less and less from SLPs who are saying like, well, this isn't really SLP based. And I'm like, this is communication based. This is the heart of what we do is communicating and communicating around regulation. Like this is what we do. And so I think it's always important that while we've talked a lot about, relationships and things like that, this is really a dyadic communication interaction. That's what co-regulation is. So really thinking about the heart of that and how important it is.
Exactly. So I mean, at the end of the day, it really is communication. And I mean, aside from that, the best thing that I probably ever learned in grad school that has time and time again just been like, yes, 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 is a student can't learn or can't any goal directed behavior, as you've put it, but they taught it to us as a kid can't learn from you in your session, or they can't develop if they're not regulated. I didn't get a lot of instruction on how to regulate kids in grad school, but they did make a big effort to say, you know, if you need to have a session that's just sitting there and listening to the kid or just playing and you're not forcing them to do something because you need to regain that trust or you need them back, you know, in a regulated state, do it. And so I think that's always important to remember that who cares? I mean, even if it wasn't communication, even if you disagreed with me on that first reason we gave, what good does it do? It's to, you know, do speech therapy or do whatever you want to do if this kid isn't ready to learn.
Yes. Yes. There's a question about IEP goals. And I don't know, Callie, if you've ever had that experience, if you inherited students. I do a lot of school consulting. I did work in schools, but right now I do more family consulting and school coaching. Because I think
I'm trying to see if you have a particular, and I'm talking to whoever asked that. I haven't scrolled down to see who it was, but if you give us an example of what that IEP goal looks like, and what was it, your IEP goal or was it an IEP goal for someone else? Because for me, often I don't write like executive function goals, but that's because I don't have an area where I can do that. And technically, sometimes, even though I can be an expert in that area, it's not my wheelhouse in, you know, in the school, or at least in my district. And so I often would support something that maybe the resource teacher would have, and maybe they would have the specific behavior goal. But if that person gives us an example of the goal, then maybe we could answer that a little bit better.
that sounds good. Yeah, let's talk play. If you want to share, if you feel comfortable sharing a goal, that would be awesome.
But more often than not, I think so many of your reels, you know, are like you as if you were sitting in an IEP meeting. A lot of the reels you have, and so maybe, I mean, we can talk about a couple of those things, but if you go scroll back in all of your reels, I think there are a lot of examples here where it's like, you know, maybe that isn't attainable. Let's try, you know, X. And, you know, sometimes the goal is unattainable, and sometimes you're not going to do an amendment to change it because you just don't have time. And guess what? That kid doesn't meet the goal. The world isn't over. That just means you need to replan, reroute. That's my 2 cents. Every district might
have different, right?
You know,
yeah,
they may think differently.
District to district. Yeah, it's always, you know, the whole team really coming together, though. It sounds like maybe the whole team could benefit from coming together and really talking about this current student's plan and actively thinking about what's going to be really meaningful for them this year.
Exactly. And especially if they're, I mean, at least if they were just speech only and going to speech or in class, that's at least 2 situations where there's going to be adults that would have responsibility for helping the student. But so many of these students actually have, who knows, 3 or 4 people that are part of their plan, and the continuity of care, like, it's not really that helpful if only 1 or 2 people know about it. You've got to be continuous in supporting them and also.
Yeah, totally. Oh, that was okay. So then there's a goal, just when the goals are focused on advanced language skills. Yeah, it is tough to explain that to parents. Yeah, I think that's important to the dialogue with parents. And I think I always like to really, for parents, and maybe this isn't the type of scenario that you're talking about, but for parents who are maybe more focused on academics versus some of those more self-management skills, I go to kind of the heart of executive function skills. So Mike's Live would probably be great. But really thinking about, aside from academics, can they drive themselves in personal and academic situations? Can they follow and have regulated goal-directed behavior? Because honestly, if that's not a self skill, then that's a great place where we can really bring in why co-regulation is so important for the student.
Exactly. And I think it's the other, exactly what you just said, but tying it all up is it's a foundational skill. It goes back to like, if they're not regulated, who cares if they have this skill, this or this skill? The way I'm going to get your student to that skill is by doing this. And I think it's still tough. And sometimes parents, it doesn't matter how eloquently or simply or whatever you put it, sometimes there's just a parent that's like, they're stuck on one thing and that's what they're going to do. But then there's other parents who are like, I didn't understand that. And I think when you're able to explain that, then they realize, wow, you really know my kid. You know, you've taken the time to realize we have X goal, but it's unattainable because we need to work on these foundational skills. And I think a lot of parents are actually really grateful when, you know, you can explain it that way.
Yes. I think, you know, I always go back to, like, I just evaluated a preschooler, and I don't want to give away any information, so I'm going to use really careful information, but they had experienced a lot of trauma, and developmentally, I'd say for executive function, for self-regulation skills, they were functioning probably more around, you know, 1 to 2 year old, and really thinking about that developmentally, and really talking to the team about the discrepancy between the academic demands and where they were at developmentally and management of self. The team really got it, and they were like, this really sounds like then our priority needs to be working on those skills via co-regulation. I was, yes, because academically the student isn't ready to be available to engage in the academics. They are really at a stage of their development where they need to prioritize co-regulation routines, rhythms, warm, responsive relationships with the adults around them to be able to be available to learn.
Exactly. So that goes with goals. It goes with, oh my goodness, everything. And it's not like sometimes the goals are unattainable in general if that child is regulated, but maybe that child spends so much time dysregulated that it isn't attainable. And I think sometimes, though, you know, maybe you do have a goal that's kind of like up here and they keep missing it, and you realize, oh, it's because they're dysregulated. Sometimes I don't change that goal, though, but I change my response, and I realize as I get them regulated, now they've met that goal. Now, it's a different story if you get them regulated and they still don't have whatever the skills are to meet that goal. And in that case, you should probably, you know, change the goal to be more in their zone of proximal development. But just coming from a place of a school-based practitioner where in my head I'm like, oh yeah, I would just change the goal, or there was not time for me to just call a parent and do an amendment and do the paperwork, and that was just the reality of it. So I think sometimes, just again, being asterisk hashtag we're being real life here, you don't necessarily have to change the goal, just change your approach.
Hey, I love it. I love change your approach. I think keeping the child at the center, keeping the whole team on the same page, those are always the priorities to really think about the child at hand.
Exactly.
Yeah. I wonder, I think this is big for me. This co-regulation, self-regulation is especially big for me for our neurodivergent kids.
Mm-hmm.
It's in particular our autistic kids. I'm like continuously confused at why we use these principles in like the trauma fields, and but yet when it comes to autistic kids, we have a different philosophy. Mm-hmm. So, and I constantly wonder, why aren't we prioritizing, you know, co-regulation and self-regulation and the development of those skills always in our practices? And I just think that's important too for your autistic kids on your caseload to really be thinking about these principles and because they apply.
For sure. And I like to think that I give people the benefit of the doubt, that it's just, you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, a couple years ago, I don't think I'd ever heard about co-regulation until probably 2 years ago. That was a term that certainly I had never heard, but as I learned more about it, I'm like, oh my goodness. Yeah. I've been focusing so much on self-regulation, and if you're trying to focus purely on self-regulation when they need more co-regulatory support from you, then your perceived behavior, whatever it is just going to intensify because you're essentially beating a dead horse. So, I mean, I think knowledge is power in this sense. And for me, it's been big just to educate, because people don't know. And especially, at least I feel like if you're in I say this from the special education world, maybe you've heard these terms more, but as a general education teacher, since we've talked about school a little bit, they don't always get training, well, more often than not. I don't think they get training on this kind of thing. They might, I think my husband teaches high school, and he just went to professional development, and one of the classes that they had to go to was like, if you have an autistic student in your class, here are some ways you can support your students. I won't get into what I thought about what they said.
You're like,
I was like, I could have taught that.
Another
but
live.
You know, they might get that. My point is, general education teachers might get that. And first of all, who knows what they are getting? And second of all, it may not be something important like co-regulation. And so I think we have a big responsibility to coach.
Yes.
And to share respectfully.
Yes. To bring it in. Like, that's what I always think about. Like, I've been carrying it in to schools, and I'm like dropping bags of it everywhere. And then I'm just coming back to bring back goodies whenever I go back. I just think about it as like an ongoing process. And I feel like once you actually, if you stop for a second and you stop and you think, when I'm really upset, what do I really need?
Yeah.
You can just pause and just sit on that for a minute. When you're having a hard time learning something, what do you really need? I mean, some people will say, like, sometimes I need tough love. And I'm like, oh, well, yeah, okay, maybe every once in a while we all can use some tough love. But if that's all I ever gave you in response to having a hard time, that's not what would feel good and what would help you. And that's us as adults.
Exactly. And that's the thing to always remember, us as adults, and think of how much more a child with, you know, a delayed regulatory system needs that. And I think someone here just said, I agree, my BCBA coach said we don't have time to do all that. And that's, I know there are so many times, and I don't know if this is what they even mean, but I was going to make this point back when we were talking about like how to support in a pre-K classroom. I was going to bring up this concept of time, because to co-regulate, sometimes you can do it in 30 seconds. They really just needed you to acknowledge that whatever is hard, you talked through it, their mind's done. But sometimes they're feeling some really big things, and it's not only feelings, but like physiologically, they are in fight or flight. Yes. And so it takes time, you know, for you to support that kid. And I think sometimes that's the hard thing, is there's not always a lot of resources, but they need that time. And so for you to say, I don't have time to help you, like as a child, that poor thing, how many times as adults do we ask someone, hey, can you help me? And they say, I don't have time.
Yeah.
Like, how does that make you feel? And you can do it by yourself, but you're just peeved. This kid isn't just peeved. This kid is now thrown into fight or flight times 10, and they are fighting or flighting. So
yeah.
I think time, just that concept of time, it's worth the investment of your time.
And I think, you know, Callie, one of the things that it is a hard part about being in today's society, though, like today's society is so wired for the quick fix. Yep. And like, you know, I've been
instant gratification.
I've been reading all about dopamine lately, Callie. I'm like deep diving. I read Dopamine Nation. I'm reading The Molecule more just because I'm just really trying to understand it. And I think this is the one thing that we have to remember is not a quick fix. Yep. Kids who are developing self-regulation skills, it's not a quick fix. Kids who have a different trajectory for self-regulation skills, it's not a quick fix. And these are the kids that, like, this is what their self-regulation development looks like. It's dips. Yep. Like my son, watching his self-regulation development, we make really amazing gains. And then we often dip. We dip down and then we go back up. And that's just development. You know, it's not always linear. It's not always this. It's a lot of this. Yep. And that's okay. It's time. It takes time. We're looking for the end goal, which is not tomorrow, not next week, not 1 month away. It's years, fucking years down the road.
Exactly. And I think we've talked about this a couple times, and it's essentially what you just said. Calibrating our expectations to be realistic. Because I think if we're not calibrating that, then we're not able to effectively help the child anyway. And then you're just frustrated. And then it takes us back to our first pillar. If you're frustrated, you can't co-regulate because you are in a tizzy. And you need to be in the right mind space to model and to support that child. So, I mean, it all comes full circle.
It always comes full circle. It always comes full circle. And I always encourage, professionals and parents, that first step of responding and attuning and providing that relationship. If you're finding yourself really triggered, that's often a good time to really consider, in all seriousness, going to therapy. Because if dysregulation is triggering for you, that might be a good chance to go explore that a little bit further and just get to know yourself a little bit more. Because you matter in this equation. As a co-regulation partner, you matter tremendously. Your mental health matters, your overall well-being matters. And so if it's continually sending you into a state of dysregulation to respond to a child's dysregulation, it's worth investigating and putting that time in for yourself.
Amen. That's like a post. I don't know who needs to hear this, but
yeah, it's just not, it's just removing, the more executive function coaching I do or intervention I do, it's more like just removing the secondary things around it. Like a lot of clients who have ADHD get really stressed that they forgot something or that they did this or that. And I'm like, you're creating a secondary problem by beating yourself down for what happened. It just is what it is. It happened. We're gonna see it, and then we're gonna deal with that versus the secondary stuff that comes with it.
I think that's really hard. I mean, we talk about this, right? And I think for some people that comes more, I don't want to say naturally, because executive function skills are developed based on experience, and the experience is we're dealt. But I mean, some people maybe have had more co-regulatory experiences in their life and have had more opportunities to develop those skills in their lives. And that's why some of us maybe seem, I always say, like, more put together, or they don't have, they're not so like freaking out about different things. But it's just like, sometimes it's the cards you're dealt. And then there's the factors of what's going on in your brain, because there's neurodiversity too. So there's just so many factors. Which I think sometimes people are probably like, oh no, I'm overwhelmed because it's going to be hard to figure this kid out. And sometimes it is. But who is going to do it if you don't?
Right. I think, like, man, I just have so much love for teachers and special educators and paras and SLPs. Like, the work that we're doing in schools, it's been a hard couple of years, but man, is it incredible. There's just really incredible things. And really implementing this stuff wholly, these principles wholly, makes literally a lifetime of a difference for kids.
Absolutely. I'm going to let you and me look at whatever this person just said. What would you say, Pete, to parents who get upset when the lead teacher is doing co-regulation with a student instead of teaching their child? Sometimes I struggle with this as I teach my parents. That's hard.
Yeah, I mean, so this is really about the parents. So this is about developing a relationship with the parents. And I would get really curious about what's driving the frustration, because really we have to talk to them in this scenario. We have to really understand what's happening for them. And, I'm not going to guess, but this scenario's happened before. And oftentimes it's some own shame and triggering of self about what happens to happen for their child. So they're like assuming their child's difficulties onto themselves. So just really developing a relationship with the parents, hearing them out, and kind of using that COAST model, just like observing and acknowledging the parent's experience.
That's exactly what I was going to say. You're going to start co-regulating now with the parents, not only with the child. You're just co-regulating because the parents need something different than their kid needs. Or maybe it's not so different. It just looks different when we're adults.
It just looks a lot different, and we just have more language as adults, and we have more internalized shame as adults. So it just looks a little bit different.
Exactly. Those little kids don't quite have that inner self-talk that can become self-deprecating.
Yeah.
So, but as adults, I mean, we talk about self-talk as a positive strategy, but we should say positive self-talk, right? Or, goal-oriented self-talk, because there's also when people have self-talk, but they can't regulate that talk, and it becomes self-deprecating. So it's a two-edged sword. Just because you teach self-talk doesn't mean...
Right. Did Mike talk about, so there's the book ADHD 2.0, a great book if you haven't read it, because I know you like resources. But they talk about the angel and the devil in ADHD, how like the voices in your head, one can, and really that looping voice, especially for ADHD folks, you can loop. You just loop on things, negatively and really harp on them. But it can happen for a lot of people who don't have ADHD, because you're right, that self-talk, that voice inside, it can go both ways.
Exactly. And it comes back to just another self-regulatory skill. Can you inhibit that voice? Because we all have that voice. We all have it coming in, but sometimes it's hard to say, get away, get
Yes.
away, get away.
Get away.
Sometimes like think about, sometimes when I'm really overwhelmed, whether it's because of self-deprecating thoughts or just something else, I talk to myself, not only in my head, subconsciously. I go sit in a mirror and I talk to myself real loud. So if anyone needs to work on that, I've done that with some of my kids too. When I see that, they need to do that, and we go to the mirror and like, you talk to yourself, get comfortable talking to yourself out loud.
I love it. Like, to make that internal talk external. I love it.
At any time, yes. That was another takeaway from Mike and I's that we'll bring in here. Anything you can do to make the internal external, it's only going to be helpful.
Good. It's good. Oh, I love it. So good.
I'm not missing anything, right? Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for like leaving good questions and comments, because it facilitates this conversation really nicely.
Totally. And I think we're probably getting close to wrapping up. So I guess also, if you are on this and you want to ask a question, I think we'll both be checking the comments too. So if things pop up, if you're watching this live, make sure you let us know you watch it. Not live, replay. Let us know you watch the replay.
Yes.
That's always super fun. And, questions are welcome after this too in the comment section.
If we get enough, we'll just have to do a 2.0. Well, I guess it'll be a 3.0.
It'll be a 3.0. But I wonder, I think we can always do a 3.0. There's always time for a 3.0.
I was going to say, there's plenty of stuff to talk about. I feel like one day maybe one day maybe I'll do a live where I can just talk, because I don't know that people really care. But like my big thing, and you've probably seen because I posted about it at the tail end of the school year, but one of my big co-regulatory things has been using my narrative language approaches and bringing it into my co-regulatory experiences and helping that scaffold and be part of structuring the environment where, we learned about narratives and story grammar and problems and feeling emotions and responding to those emotions. We did that in the speech therapy room. And then we learned that happens to us too with personal narratives. And then it transferred it to the classroom, where I had a student who would say, I have a problem. She couldn't identify that she had problems before. And if they don't realize something's going on, it's really hard to move them to self-regulate. She couldn't self-regulate yet, but she could say, I have a problem, which would trigger, I told the teacher, that means you need to go over here to her and support her and say, how are you feeling? And because she could talk through that, I'm really upset. Or if she couldn't because she was in fight or flight, it's like, wow, you look really upset, huh? Something must have happened that was hard. So if you don't know how to have those conversations, sometimes using your narrative language approach can kind of scaffold those interactions. And it hasn't worked for all my kids, but for a couple of kids, it's been night and day. So maybe I think I'll get on a live one day and just talk about it. Because it's a good, if you don't know what it's supposed to look like, there's not one way for it to look like.
Right.
But it could be something that maybe.
You have a resource, don't you? You have a resource to support this.
I think I have, I made posts, and I have a lot of narrative language, story grammar type resources. They don't have any instructional methodologies for I'm going to co-regulate by doing A, B, C, D, E, but I have kind of walked through that in posts. So maybe I'll share those.
I think you should make, yeah.
I just think it's really helpful. Together. And it's like killing two birds with one stone, because you're still meeting your goals. That's something that they have to do in their curriculum, is tell and retell stories, generate stories, and you're using it as a learning device to co-regulate. So,
Yeah. And narratives for me always, every evaluation I do, it always comes into play, because narratives are just the bones of everything.
Exactly.
They're the bones.
Exactly. Alrighty.
So
well, I guess you're right. We have 5 minutes until 8 o'clock. And I think, we have done a good job of giving a good overview of co-regulation. Obviously, it's the foundation and leads the way to self-regulation. I think one of the reasons, other than the fact that I just really like talking to you, and I think this is a really good topic, is when we did Mike's, a lot of times people were like, I just don't think my kid is at this self-regulation state yet. And I was like, you know, I have someone who we can talk to who, you know, it might fit your kid's developmental level a little better. So hopefully if you listen to the other live and were like, I just don't think my kid's there yet, hopefully something today was helpful.
Yeah. Just remember that pouring the glass, right? If you were like, wow, I think my child is, on their way, every child is always on their way. Just where they're at with the glasses is going to be different. And so make sure you're considering the individual child in front of you, whether it's your child or your student, and really what are their developmental needs for self-regulation. And if they need more co-regulation supports, that just is. It is. That is what it is.
Exactly. That was a perfect wrap up.
Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for everything. Do you want to, I mean, some of these people probably already follow you, but tell them where they can find you if they don't already follow you.
Yeah. Coming over to @Miss Danielle Kent. I'm sure I'll be tagged in this or something like that.
Exactly.
So you can find me there. DanielleKent.com is my website. I'm putting a course together on co-regulation. So I'm going to probably look at launching that in September just to go really in depth to all of these facets. So that's in the works.
Perfect. I'm excited. So everyone keep your eyes out. I know I will.
I love it.
Alrighty. Well, this is perfect timing because I hear the baby crying. So
perfect. Go
Thank
enjoy.
you. Bye everyone. Have a good night.
Bye everyone. Thank you.